The invitation appeared routine, another discreet royal guest welcomed into the orbit of the crown. But according to whispers circulating through palace corridors, one quiet discovery changed everything. Within hours, schedules shifted, doors closed, and a private audience with the king was abruptly rearranged. No announcement followed. Yet those watching closely believed one question had triggered it all. Who had this guest been speaking to and why? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, there was nothing unusual about the gathering itself. Royal residences have long operated on layers of ceremony and discretion, where private lunches become strategic conversations and guest lists often include figures whose names never appear in public records. Reports suggest this occasion followed the same familiar pattern. Invitations had been extended quietly. Attendance remained selective. Those involved were believed to be individuals considered trusted, established, and entirely uncontroversial. Among them was one particular guest who, according to various interpretations circulating later among royal observers, arrived without attracting the slightest concern. The individual was said to be well-connected, polished, and familiar enough with royal customs to move comfortably within the environment. No alarms, no hesitation, no indication that anything about the visit would stand out from countless others before it. And that may be exactly why what happened next reportedly caused such unease. According to palace administrative whispers and commentary later echoed by insiders, routine background reviews were taking place behind the scenes, as they often do before and during sensitive royal gatherings. Such reviews are not unusual. Connections are checked. Histories are reviewed. Associations are mapped quietly, not necessarily because danger is expected, but because proximity to the crown has always carried symbolic weight. Initially, nothing appeared remarkable. Then a threat emerged. Nobody publicly described it. Nobody confirmed details. But reports suggest a historical or personal connection surfaced unexpectedly during those quiet reviews, a connection that allegedly intersected with Meghan's wider network in ways that some inside palace circles had not anticipated. Was it recent? Was it old? Was it direct? Interpretations vary. What multiple accounts seem to agree on, however, was the effect. The mood shifted. Observers familiar with royal routines later suggested that movement inside private administrative corridors changed almost immediately. Conversations reportedly shortened. Access became more controlled. Certain meetings appeared to be reconsidered. Staff who normally moved freely through preparation schedules were allegedly instructed to redirect questions elsewhere. One insider interpretation described the atmosphere not as panic, but as recalculation. Because in royal institutions, concern is rarely expressed dramatically. It appears quietly, through closed doors, through altered timing, through requests for information. And according to persistent reports surrounding this moment, one request arrived faster than expected. King Charles reportedly asked for a private briefing. No public engagement was canceled, no visible statement emerged. But those familiar with palace operations have long argued that when private audiences are rearranged unexpectedly, it usually reflects one thing. Information has arrived that someone believes cannot wait. Exactly what was presented remains unclear. Some interpretations suggest advisors framed the issue as symbolic rather than personal. Others believe the concern centered less on relationships and more on perception. Not guilt, not scandal, but access. Who knows whom? Who enters which room? Who carries which history? That distinction matters inside institutions built not only on tradition, but on appearances. Following that briefing, reports suggest instructions became increasingly narrow. Staff were allegedly encouraged to avoid speculation. Guest discussions reportedly became restricted. Questions were redirected. Access points became more selective. And strangely, the silence itself began attracting attention. Because the palace has weathered controversy before. But secrecy of this kind felt different. Measured. Deliberate. As though someone believed this was not yet a problem but could become one if left untouched. And that is where the story reportedly changed. Because concern alone doesn't trigger royal intervention, what surfaced next reportedly transformed curiosity into urgency. At first, it looked like coincidence. Then patterns began to emerge: old introductions, overlapping circles, and private meetings that suddenly seemed less accidental than anyone first believed. The silence that followed the private briefing did not settle concerns inside royal circles, it amplified them. What had initially been treated as routine caution reportedly began evolving into something more difficult to dismiss. Not because anyone claimed wrongdoing, not because some explosive revelation had suddenly surfaced, but because once questions start appearing around access to the monarchy, even ordinary details can begin to feel unusually heavy. According to interpretations circulating among palace observers, attention slowly shifted away from the guest as an individual and toward the wider network surrounding them. Names that once seemed disconnected were quietly reconsidered. Introductions that had happened years apart reportedly appeared on internal timelines. Shared events, mutual acquaintances, professional overlaps, social intersections. None of it seemed dramatic in isolation, yet together, some believed the pattern created uncomfortable questions. Reports suggest staff members tasked with reviewing private access records began approaching the issue from entirely different perspectives. One group reportedly viewed the matter as insignificant, a modern reality of public life, where influential circles naturally overlap. Their position, according to insiders, was simple: proximity does not equal intention. Connections do not automatically carry meaning. To them, the palace risked creating unnecessary tension over something that reflected ordinary social dynamics. But another camp allegedly reached a more cautious conclusion. Their concern was not who knew whom. Their concern was what those relationships represented. Because royal institutions have always operated under a different standard than ordinary public life. Historically, private access has rarely been treated casually. Invitations are symbolic. Introductions matter. Presence itself can become interpreted as endorsement even when no such endorsement exists. That distinction reportedly became central to internal conversations. Various interpretations suggest historical precedent was quietly raised behind closed doors. Not scandals. Not accusations. Simply reminders that royal proximity has often carried consequences beyond personal intent. Those who enter private spaces around the crown are rarely judged only by what they do, but by what others believe their presence means. And according to multiple accounts, this is where Meghan's name reportedly returned to the conversation. Not through dramatic allegations, not through claims of direct involvement, but through historical context. Observers allegedly noted that because public narratives surrounding royal relationships had already become intensely scrutinized in recent years, any unexpected overlap, however ordinary, risked generating interpretations far beyond the palace's control. Suddenly, the issue no longer seemed administrative. It became symbolic. That reportedly created a difficult divide among advisors. Some argued restraint. Do nothing. Escalation would only validate speculation. Others reportedly warned the opposite, that silence can sometimes create larger narratives than action ever could. And so the question shifted again. Not, is there a problem? But, what happens if people think there is one? According to interpretations of internal discussions, advisors urged King Charles to move carefully. The concern, they suggested, was no longer about personalities. It was about preserving distance, where distance mattered. One recommendation reportedly favored maintaining normal appearances and avoiding disruption entirely. Another allegedly argued for subtle recalibration, small procedural changes, quiet adjustments, reduced exposure. Neither side claimed certainty. Both sides claimed caution. That left Charles facing a familiar burden that royal history has repeated endlessly, deciding whether preserving openness creates strength or vulnerability. Reports suggest no immediate verdict emerged. Instead, discussions reportedly narrowed. Language became more measured. Recommendations became more specific. Access became a subject of review rather than assumption. And quietly, almost without anyone noticing when it happened, the conversation stopped being about one guest. It became about what their presence represented. Because inside institutions built on continuity, influence does not always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it arrives politely. Sometimes it appears harmless. And sometimes the question becomes impossible to ignore, not whether something happened, but whether enough people believe it might have. Yet in royal history, perception has often carried consequences equal to reality. No cameras captured the meeting. No statement followed. But palace observers insist that after one closed-door briefing, the atmosphere around the event changed completely. Whatever uncertainty had existed before now reportedly began narrowing into something more deliberate. The questions that had quietly circulated among advisors no longer seemed theoretical. According to interpretations from royal commentators and those who claim familiarity with palace rhythms, the conversation moved from observation to evaluation. Not because anyone had uncovered a scandal, not because there had been some dramatic confrontation behind closed doors, but because institutions built on continuity rarely wait for certainty before considering consequences. Reports suggest King Charles received confidential advice shortly after concerns surrounding the guests' connections reached a more formal stage of discussion. No details were released. No summaries emerged. Yet palace watchers have long argued that some of the monarchy's most significant decisions begin exactly this way, not with declarations, but with carefully framed briefings designed to answer questions before they become public ones. And this briefing, according to multiple interpretations, may have carried a different tone. The issue reportedly presented to the king was not whether the guest had done anything improper. It was whether allowing circumstances to continue unchanged would create interpretations that could become impossible to control later. That distinction changed everything. Sources differ on what recommendations were placed before Charles, but several accounts suggest the debate became unexpectedly philosophical. One position reportedly emphasized hospitality. Royal households have always relied on discretion, relationships, and carefully maintained networks. Invitations are extended for many reasons. Not every overlap deserves scrutiny. Not every connection deserves suspicion. Those voices allegedly argued that narrowing access too aggressively could create a dangerous message of its own, that ordinary associations were being treated as controversies. But another view reportedly emerged with equal force. Institutional boundaries. Not personal rejection. Not punishment. Boundaries. According to various interpretations, some senior figures argued that monarchy operates differently from private life because meaning is constantly assigned to proximity. Presence can become narrative. Association can become symbolism. Even unintended appearances can shape public interpretation. That reportedly pushed discussions into more difficult territory. What matters more, showing confidence or protecting distance? As those questions circulated, reports suggest senior royals began weighing broader reputational risks. Not immediate headlines. Not temporary commentary. Legacy. Continuity. The preservation of structures that survive beyond personalities. Observers familiar with royal traditions often describe these moments as quiet stress tests. Decisions are rarely framed around individuals alone. Instead, they are filtered through a larger question: what precedent does this create? According to interpretations later circulating among insiders, some believed caution would project strength. Others feared caution would project insecurity. Neither side appeared completely comfortable. That uncertainty reportedly produced a strange atmosphere around the palace. No visible changes, no public adjustments, and yet people allegedly began noticing absences. Conversations became shorter. Questions received fewer answers. Schedules appeared less flexible. Nothing dramatic happened, but increasingly nothing seemed accidental. Reports suggest aides themselves began dividing not publicly but internally. Some interpreted the concern as overcorrection. Others quietly believed restraint had arrived too late. Meanwhile, Charles was reportedly presented with competing recommendations. Wait. Observe. Act quietly. Do nothing. Reduce exposure. Maintain normality. No single path appeared obvious. But according to those who study royal institutions, the moment a timeline begins forming, decisions are rarely far behind. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, silence itself began changing shape. At first it looked like discipline, then caution, then something more noticeable. Because when enough people stop speaking at once, others begin asking why. By the following day, silence itself had become the loudest signal. Royal decisions rarely arrive with dramatic declarations. More often they appear as calendar changes, altered seating plans, and invitations that quietly disappear. By the morning after the briefing, there was still no public acknowledgement that anything had changed. Official schedules remained intact. Engagement notices looked ordinary. No unusual announcement emerged from palace communications. To anyone watching from a distance, the institution appeared exactly as it had the day before. But according to observers familiar with how royal households function beneath the surface, that appearance may have been the point. Because the monarchy rarely announces adjustment in real time. It absorbs, it reorganizes, and then it moves. Reports suggest that sometime after competing recommendations had been presented, King Charles reached a private conclusion, not necessarily dramatic, not necessarily final, but sufficient to trigger action. Various interpretations describe the decision not as punishment or rejection, but as recalibration. The objective, according to those accounts, was allegedly simple: reduce variables, narrow exposure, and preserve institutional distance until uncertainty no longer existed. No one publicly called it intervention, but observers later began noticing signs that something had shifted. Event logistics reportedly started changing in ways subtle enough to escape immediate attention, but deliberate enough to invite questions. Seating arrangements were allegedly reconsidered. Timing windows appeared adjusted. Certain opportunities for informal interaction reportedly became more controlled. Nothing disappeared entirely, yet nothing remained exactly where it had been. Those familiar with royal customs have long argued that changes like these communicate more than statements ever could. Access, placement, timing. Inside royal structures, these details often carry their own language. According to reports circulating among palace insiders, guest arrangements became a particular point of focus. Reviews were allegedly conducted quietly and without confrontation. Invitations were not publicly revoked. Attendance was not publicly challenged. Instead, options narrowed. Routes changed. Expectations adjusted. The effect, according to interpretations later discussed by commentators, was not exclusion, it was distance. And distance, inside institutions built on symbolism, can speak with extraordinary force. At the same time, reports suggest protocol and security teams began operating with increased coordination. Not heightened alarm. Not emergency measures. Just a level of synchronization that some observers interpreted as unusual for what had originally appeared to be a routine social concern. Movements became more deliberate. Approvals became more layered. Questions reportedly traveled upward instead of outward. And still, publicly, nothing happened. That silence itself reportedly became policy. According to accounts from those watching closely, staff received clear instructions to maintain discretion. Discussions remained internal. Interpretations were discouraged. Explanations stayed limited. Not because there was necessarily something to hide, but because, in royal logic, premature explanations can sometimes create larger stories than silence ever does. That approach, however, created its own consequences. Because outside observers began noticing unusual movements, precisely because nobody addressed them. People noticed changed rhythms. People noticed absences. People noticed that ordinary details suddenly felt unusually managed. And as attention widened, interpretations multiplied. Some believed the palace was protecting tradition. Others believed it was avoiding unnecessary noise. Still, others began wondering whether decisions had already moved beyond caution into something more permanent. But perhaps the most unsettling detail was this. According to several interpretations, no visible confrontation ever occurred. No dramatic conversation. No public discomfort. No obvious rupture. Only a sequence of quiet adjustments that seemed too coordinated to be accidental. And once people started recognizing the pattern, attention shifted away from what the palace had done and toward how others would respond. Because removing a guest was only part of the story, the reaction would prove far more revealing. The decision itself remained unseen. The aftermath did not. If the previous hours had been defined by quiet adjustments and invisible recalculations, what followed was something stranger, an atmosphere that could not be explained, but could somehow be felt. Nothing dramatic entered public view. Official engagements continued. Press notes remained ordinary. The institution projected calm, yet according to interpretations circulating through royal commentary and private observation, something beneath the surface had undeniably changed. Reports suggest the first responses came not from public figures, but from those who live closest to royal routines. Courtiers, staff, longtime advisors. People whose roles depend not on headlines but on reading movement, tone, and timing. According to various interpretations, their reaction was remarkably cautious. Nobody reportedly rushed to conclusions. Nobody openly challenged decisions. Instead, conversations allegedly became more measured, more coded, more careful. Because when a palace does not explain itself, people begin studying what it does not say. Some reportedly interpreted recent developments as entirely procedural, a temporary recalibration, designed to reduce distractions and preserve order. In that reading, nothing larger had happened. Royal households constantly adjust access, seating, schedules, and expectations. But another interpretation quietly gained momentum. What if this was never about logistics? What if it was about signaling limits? That possibility reportedly changed the nature of private discussions. According to accounts circulating among royal observers, conversations increasingly shifted toward loyalty, not in the dramatic sense of betrayal, but in the quieter, more complicated sense of proximity. Who belongs close to the institution? Who remains adjacent? Who determines the boundaries? Questions that once seemed abstract reportedly started becoming more immediate. And with those questions came another uncomfortable theme: access. Because access inside royal structures has never been treated as neutral. It represents trust, continuity, expectation. According to interpretations later discussed by commentators, the concern no longer appeared centered on one guest or one connection. Instead, people began asking a larger question. If boundaries are adjusted once, where do they settle next? That uncertainty created unusual tension. Not public tension. Internal tension. The kind that doesn't announce itself but changes the temperature of conversations. Reports suggest some believed recent decisions represented strength, the crown quietly protecting its own institutional distance. Others reportedly worried about the opposite, that too much distance can create narratives of fragility. Meanwhile, public-facing schedules continued almost flawlessly. Appearances remained polished. Commitments remained intact. No outward disruption emerged. And perhaps that normality became the most unsettling detail of all. Because when institutions continue functioning perfectly during periods of speculation, observers often assume the real decisions are happening elsewhere. Commentators began offering interpretations. Some framed recent developments as routine management. Others suggested it reflected broader questions about influence and symbolism in modern royal life. Still others argued that people were assigning too much meaning to ordinary adjustments. But across nearly every interpretation, one shift appeared consistent. Attention stopped focusing on the guest. Attention moved toward the institution itself, its rules, its limits, its invisible lines. That shift reportedly created a paradox. The less the palace said, the more people searched for meaning, and the more meaning people searched for, the larger the silence became. Officially, nothing had changed. Unofficially, everyone seemed to think something had. The palace maintained its silence. No confirmations, no clarifications, no corrections. Only continuity. But continuity, in moments like these, rarely ends discussion. Sometimes it begins it. And with silence came something even more powerful: interpretation. Every royal controversy eventually becomes something larger than personalities. It becomes a debate about continuity. By the time the speculation reached its peak, the original question had already begun to disappear. The guest no longer sat at the center of the discussion. The supposed connection no longer carried the same weight. Instead, what remained was something older, quieter, and far more difficult to answer. What exactly does an institution protect when it protects itself? That question has followed monarchies for generations, not because every controversy is historic, but because every controversy eventually collides with history. In this fictionalized royal drama, the atmosphere surrounding recent events seemed to reveal something familiar: the tension between openness and preservation. Not because anyone had declared a crisis, not because anyone had claimed betrayal, but because institutions built to outlive individuals often interpret uncertainty differently than ordinary families do. According to the logic often assigned to royal storytelling, moments like these rarely become personal for long. They become symbolic. They become historical. And once that shift happens, every decision starts carrying two meanings at once: the immediate reason and the larger message. Observers of monarchy have long noted that access has never been treated as a casual matter. Invitations carry meaning. Presence creates assumptions. Distance communicates restraint. Throughout different eras, royal households have often been imagined as balancing two competing responsibilities, appearing accessible while remaining protected. That balance has never been simple. Open too widely and people question the boundaries. Close too tightly and people question the confidence. And somewhere in the middle sits the burden of continuity. In this story's interpretation, that burden increasingly seemed to settle around Charles, not as a dramatic ruler making declarations, not as a figure choosing sides, but as someone positioned between competing expectations. Modern audiences often expect visibility, openness, and emotional transparency. Institutions, however, are frequently portrayed as moving more slowly, protecting process over reaction. That contrast reportedly became the invisible pressure shaping every quiet adjustment. Some interpretations imagined restraint as unnecessary, others imagined restraint as responsible. Neither side appeared entirely satisfied. Because continuity rarely feels satisfying in the moment. It feels cautious, measured, sometimes frustrating. And only later do people decide whether it looked wise. As commentators and observers continued projecting meaning onto every detail, another idea quietly emerged. Perhaps invitations and exclusions had never truly been about individuals at all. Perhaps they functioned as signals, not declarations of worth, not judgments of character. Signals of where the institution believed its lines should exist. That possibility changed the emotional tone surrounding everything that followed. The discussion became less about whether one person should have remained included. It became about whether institutions preserve themselves by expanding trust, or by defining its limits. And once that question appears, there are rarely easy answers. Because institutions do not protect feelings. They protect continuity. They protect legitimacy. They protect the belief that tomorrow will resemble yesterday enough to remain recognizable. That does not mean every decision is correct. It does not mean every silence is meaningful. But in stories like this, silence often becomes the language through which caution speaks. Publicly, schedules continued. Officially, nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet privately, at least in the interpretations surrounding the moment, the conversation had already moved beyond one gathering, one guest, or one connection. Something larger had taken its place. A question with no clean ending. A question that institutions have wrestled with for generations. And even after the guest departed, one final question refused to disappear. No formal explanation arrived. And sometimes royal silence becomes its own kind of statement. By this stage, the absence of answers had become more influential than answers themselves. Officially, there was still nothing to confirm. No announcement, no clarification, no acknowledgement that any unusual decision had taken place at all. Public schedules continued. Communications remained restrained. Appearances stayed measured. Yet outside official channels, interpretations had already begun multiplying faster than facts. And that is often where stories like this take on a life of their own. Because once silence enters the conversation, people rarely leave empty spaces untouched. They fill them with theories, with assumptions, with meaning. According to various interpretations circulating among observers, what had begun as quiet curiosity slowly evolved into competing explanations, each attempting to answer the same unresolved question through entirely different lenses. Some argued nothing meaningful had happened. Their interpretation was straightforward. Private guest management happens constantly inside institutions built around protocol. Seating changes, access adjustments, quiet recalibrations. To them, ordinary discretion had simply collided with public curiosity. Others viewed the sequence differently. They questioned timing. Why now? Why this guest? Why so much quiet coordination surrounding something that supposedly required no explanation? That line of thinking did not necessarily assume wrongdoing. Instead, it focused on symbolism, the idea that institutions rarely move without considering what those movements communicate. And that distinction became increasingly important, because reports and speculation often compete for the same space, but they do not operate by the same rules. Verified information remained limited. Interpretation expanded. Observers reportedly began studying details that, under normal circumstances, might have passed unnoticed. Timing became a subject. Scheduling became a subject. Language became a subject. Even the absence of language became a subject. According to commentators reflecting on the broader meaning, rather than the alleged event itself, the debate slowly transformed into something more abstract. Was the reaction precautionary? Was it strategic? Or had people projected significance onto routine institutional behavior because mystery invites interpretation? No consensus appeared. And perhaps that uncertainty became the most powerful force of all. Because in the absence of confirmation, every observer began telling a different version of the same story. One version imagined careful stewardship. Another imagined heightened sensitivity. Another imagined that nothing unusual had happened at all. Yet despite the differences, most interpretations seemed to return to one common idea. Whatever the reasoning, the response appeared designed to prevent meaning from attaching itself too firmly to access. Not punishment, not exclusion. Containment of interpretation. That possibility only intensified public fascination. People became less interested in discovering facts and more interested in decoding intention. Commentators widened the discussion. What does access mean? What creates trust? When institutions remain silent, does that protect stability or invite more speculation? The questions multiplied faster than any answer could. And quietly, almost unnoticed, the center of gravity shifted again. The guest became secondary. The connection became secondary. Even the alleged decision itself became secondary. The real story, the one observers seemed unable to stop discussing, was no longer whether something happened. It was what people believed the silence revealed. Because mystery has a strange effect on institutions. Facts establish boundaries. Mystery removes them. And once mystery overtakes facts, stories stop belonging to events and begin belonging to interpretation, which may explain why no final explanation ever seemed to satisfy anyone. Because in the end, the story may never have been about one guest at all. The guest left. The schedule continued. The palace doors remained closed. And in the end, perhaps that was always how this story was destined to conclude. Not with declarations. Not with dramatic farewells. Not with a carefully delivered statement intended to settle every question. Instead, what remained was something quieter, and somehow more enduring, the familiar rhythm of continuity, returning to the foreground, while curiosity lingered just outside the gates. Days passed. Official engagements continued. Public appearances resumed their ordinary pattern. Nothing in the visible structure of royal life appeared disrupted. And yet, for those who had followed every whisper, every adjustment, every carefully measured silence, the feeling remained that something had happened, not necessarily something explosive, but something revealing. Because institutions often tell their stories through what they continue to do. The guest departed. The palace carried on. And somewhere inside that contrast sat the entire tension of the moment. According to the interpretations that surrounded this fictional royal drama, the final lesson never seemed to center on personalities at all. The names that originally dominated attention gradually faded into the background. The speculation softened. The theories multiplied and then lost momentum. But the larger questions remained. How much openness strengthens an institution? How much distance protects it? When does caution become wisdom, and when does it become overinterpretation? No official answer arrived. Perhaps none ever could. That uncertainty frustrated some observers and reassured others. Some saw restraint as evidence of stability. Others saw silence as an invitation to wonder. And maybe both reactions reveal something important. Because public fascination with private institutions has always followed the same pattern. People do not simply want to know what happened. They want to know what it means. That desire turns ordinary decisions into symbols. It transforms routine adjustments into narratives. It encourages every absence, every pause, every unanswered question to carry more significance than it may deserve. Yet reality and interpretation rarely move at the same speed. Rumors expand, stories evolve, assumptions become emotionally persuasive. But institutions, especially institutions built around tradition, often move differently. Slowly, carefully, sometimes frustratingly. Not because they reject change, but because they believe continuity itself communicates confidence. And that may be why this ending feels unresolved. Because no dramatic confirmation arrived. No hidden truth suddenly emerged. No final conversation unlocked every unanswered question. Instead, there was only movement, private decisions, public continuity, and a reminder that not every closed door conceals a revelation. Sometimes it simply remains closed. In this version of events, Charles was never portrayed as choosing controversy over calm or loyalty over distance. If anything, the interpretation that endured was simpler than that. Protect the institution. Reduce unnecessary meaning. Allow time to do what explanations often cannot. Whether that approach feels reassuring or unsatisfying may depend entirely on the person watching. But perhaps that discomfort is part of why stories like this continue to resonate. Because people rarely remember moments of certainty. They remember moments that left space for interpretation. And maybe that was the final irony of all. After so much attention, so many questions, and so many competing narratives, what endured was not the identity of the guest. It was the mystery created by the silence that followed. In royal life, departures are rarely announced, but the decisions behind them often echo far longer than the footsteps leaving the room. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.